So we will officially start our webinar now because we have a wonderful guest to join us this week. Alya Shandra, the editor-in-chief of Euromaidan Press, is here with us. And so I'll be posting things in the chat as we go. Please do use the Q&A function as usual. We want this to be really engaged. You don't need to wait till the end to ask questions or make comments. Unless you tell me not to, I'm likely to repost your Q&A question into the chat with your name. So if you don't want me to do that, you can submit a question anonymously, or you can tell me not to repost your question. So welcome and thank you for being here. I'm going to turn things over right away to Roman to get us started with our conversation, so we have as much time with Alya Shandra today as possible.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everybody. It's nice to see your names. Unfortunately, I can't see your faces, and I miss a lot of you, all of you, actually. Those of you who I know, and I look forward to meeting those who I don't. I'm excited to introduce once again my friend Alya Shandra to the series. And when I reached out to her a few days ago, trying to see if she would be interested in being guest speaker, there's one thing that she said that made me think. She said, well, I'm not sure I'm ready to talk. I've been listening for the past few months. It's been a while since I've spoken. And to me, and this is not an exact quote, but that's what she said. But to me, that kind of humble expression means a lot, because I know what Alya does and how she does it. She's basically trying to tell Ukraine's story to the world. And the fact that this person with so much experience, with so many interesting ideas, is so humble to acknowledge that, I've been listening. I'm not ready to speak, and that's like, she breaks my heart. So I'm happy. I'm happy, Alya. I gotta do it. I had to do it, Alya. I know you've been a little nervous joining today's session, but I hope you're no longer nervous. In fact, I'm nervous for some reason. I don't know why. But I think we've met a few years ago. One thing that kind of unites us is our story with the Urban Space 500, which is a public restaurant in the center of Kyiv, which is basically, I don't know if the people who don't know, but this is a public restaurant that a civil society activist made happen. Like 500 people, not necessarily from the city of Kyiv, but from all over Ukraine, decided to chip in, um, and um, and create a public restaurant. We would be open to a lot of people. You can not only eat there and drink. Um, by the way, cocktails there are still pretty good. And but also have meaningful discussions, go to lectures and meet change makers. So some of these Urban Space 500 impact investors you've already met during our sessions, and so Alya is one of them. So again, we've met a few years ago, but that was pretty much it. We've exchanged a few messages here and there, but I'm following Euromaidan Press, which is the creation of Alya and her friends, and we're going to talk a little bit about it later on. But we usually begin our sessions with a simple question, but it's not so simple, as we've learned, which is, what is Ukrainian victory for you, Alya? What would you know that Ukraine has won?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with you. For me, Ukrainian victory is when Ukraine, A, regains its internationally recognized territories, when it is no longer occupied by Russia, and B, when it is a free democratic state that is free to choose its own destiny without any foreign pressure, and which is free to build its own future, overcoming the traumas of its totalitarian past. And it is for this future that we are fighting for. And I think we need to take a look at, for instance, Georgia, because Georgia is also half occupied by Russia, but it is also having a lot of trouble recently in charting its own path due to influence from Russia and from Russia-aligned politicians. So in essence, Russia's goal is to stop Ukraine's existence as an independent state. The only Ukraine that Russia will accept if it becomes a vassal to Russia. And if Ukraine is free from Russian occupation but is a vassal to Russia, that will not be Ukrainian victory. Ukrainian victory is an independent state that freely charts its own future.
Thank you. And it's especially important to remember during these past 2.5 years when some of our partners and allies have been trying to talk Ukraine into some form of peace, whereas we're not the ones who've started this war. So I think they should be addressing their pleas for peace to someone else, not Ukraine. Okay. Our audience, our listeners couldn't help but notice your wonderful, impeccable English. What do you want our audience to know about you? And question from me is, where did you learn English so well?
Yeah, so I grew up in the United States. My story was that my mom got invited to work in Seattle in a laboratory when the Soviet Union fell apart. And instead of staying 6 months, we stayed for longer, and I went to school there. And that's why how I got a sense of what America is and how it is to live in another world. And then we came back when I was 7th grade or so. And since that time, I've been a citizen of both worlds, I guess. This, for instance, this would mean that I also followed the career path of my mother. So when I grew up, I went to university, I became a researcher, and the way that researchers work in Ukraine is they try to find grants, because otherwise you cannot survive on the salary, you cannot survive in this infrastructure. To do science, you need to find foreign partners, you need to apply for grants. And I started doing the same thing because it's the only way that I saw. And when I went back to the United States to a laboratory to do a research project, and I was visiting our old friends, the woman asked me a very simple question. So you're just like your mom, like you guys are coming here to do science to the United States from Ukraine. Again, she was doing this 20 years ago, now you're doing it. So how come you're coming here? How come we're not coming to Ukraine? How come researchers from the States are not coming to Ukraine to do science there? And it was a very surprising question, like it was obvious. For me, it was always obvious. Of course we need to go there. And then, but that really got me thinking. That was the first time that I started thinking, yeah, like why? Why is this the only viable career path for scientists in Ukraine? Why are so many people dreaming of emigrating? Why do many things not work in Ukraine? Why is it the way that it is? And that sort of jump-started my path into activism. I started wanting to change things a little bit, at least a little bit. And I think this was the time when an active civil society was being forged in Ukraine. There were many activist groups that were trying to tackle little issues. For instance, in Kiev, there was a very active urban society that was protesting against illegal construction. Basically, people were uniting, and they were believing that they could change the city to be a better place. So I started getting involved in little initiatives like this, and especially during the repression of Yanukovych's times, there were people who resisted. There were people who united to monitor elections and report electoral falsifications. There were people who blocked polling places when they saw that the results were being falsified. They would just physically block them. And people were uniting because they started believing in the possibility to change what is wrong in Ukraine. And it was a very uplifting time. And of course, all of this started being crushed in Yanukovych's, when Yanukovych turned away from signing the association agreement with the EU, and Euromaidan erupted. All of this, it was just a feeling that the authoritarianism and repression was rising. And This is why Euromaidan erupted when it did. So the question was, Roman, where do I know my English? Yeah. So yeah, that's basically my story. That's my story of turning away from a career path of science because I saw that something very important was happening in my country. And this story during Euromaidan, it was being communicated absolutely in a falsified way, because at that time there were very few English language outlets in Ukraine. There were no translations of Ukrainian medias. Even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of all places, it did not have an English version, at least not one that was regularly updated. And amid in this time when there was such an important story going on in Ukraine, the world was listening to it through the voices of Russian media, because Russian media, they had these English language versions. They had foreign correspondents working from the Moscow offices. And this is how we united at Euromaidan to resist this, to tell Ukraine's story in English. And since I knew English from my childhood in the United States, of course, I joined the protesters and I wanted to help. And so such is the story of the birth of Euromaidan Press.
Yeah, and in a minute I'll explain to those who don't know what Euromaidan is, but I'll briefly explain that. But I wanted to wish you a happy birthday. I think you had a birthday like a couple of days ago.
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Right? Okay, well, happy birthday.
Thank you.
And I know what a lot of Ukrainians do, and this can be one of the examples to our audience. And what are some of the I'm not gonna say it, I'm gonna ask you, like what's your best birthday present has been in the past 2.5 years? What do Ukrainians do when they have birthdays and want to know, when they want the rest of the world to know that it's that birthday? What kind of present do you want on their birthday?
The best birthday presents that Ukrainians want is to ask to donate to the fundraisers of their friends that gather for military stuff. And that is what I asked also on my birthday. I asked for people to donate to the fundraiser of a theologian and religious scientist who became a sniper during the war. And now he's like the patron saint of all Ukrainian snipers. He fundraises to buy them rifles, to buy them bullets, to buy them scopes, to buy everything that a well-qualified sniper needs. And it's one of the surprising transformations of people during this period, 10 years of war. People have abandoned their everyday activities. Whoever was a professor now became a sniper and a fundraiser for snipers. It's something that we need to do to survive. We put our regular life on hold to do this. And usually all the birthday announcements in my Facebook feed, they're basically calls to help for fundraise for this stuff. So
Yeah.
that
Well,
is my birthday.
great. And I hope you raised your goal. I mean, I hope you achieved your goal. And I think I'm having a trouble hearing you. I don't know about the others, but I think it's we're having, like, maybe you can fix your mic. Just make sure that
Okay.
our audience
How
can
about
hear
that?
you.
Is that better?
I think so. I think that's a little better. Yes.
Like this? This is better?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
thank
I'll
you.
just hold it like this. Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you. So did you reach your goal? The amount, did you raise the amount that you were aiming to raise, or are you still few
No,
thousand?
it's there is no end to this fundraising, really, because the longer that the war drags on, the more things that we need. It's not like he fundraises for just like $2,000 and stops. No, after that there's the next fundraiser. So it's basically it depends on how much people are willing to give, and of course we all depend on one another in this time. The people back home, they depend on the soldiers that are defending them. The soldiers, they depend on the people back home that can fundraise to buy them the drones and the sniper rifles that they need. It's an ongoing collective effort of Ukrainian people to survive.
Yeah, and I believe there was an article in New York Times a few months ago about how Ukrainians have mastered the art of crowdfunding. And I believe, like many of us on this call have done it, and many of the people in the audience have donated for the Ukrainian cause. And I want to, use this opportunity to thank everyone for keeping an eye on Ukraine and supporting Ukraine financially. And and physically.
Thank you.
Um,
It makes a huge difference. Thank you so much.
yes. So yeah, and your story is moving in the sense that you really had no choice but to come back to Ukraine because you were still young, right? I mean, we can say that you're like you felt the Ukraine calling because you were such a, dignified civil society activist when you were what, like 5 or 12? I don't
Uh-huh.
know.
No,
But I'm
yeah.
trying
So,
to
so
I'm
this
trying to insert my silly jokes here and there. I mean,
yeah.
but so I still want to applaud you for coming back, because also had one of the guests, Yevhen Libovitsky, I think it was about a year ago or 6 months ago, who had been studying in the US when Ukraine became independent. And so he felt that, he wanted to abandon all of it and return to Ukraine because he, like your American friend who talked about, why our Americans are not going to Ukraine to do their like studies. He returned to Ukraine, and he's one of the co-founders of Urban Space 500. That was not the only reason he came to Ukraine, but um, I want to ask you, what was your biggest shock when you returned to Ukraine? Like, because you've lived in the US for some time, you went to school in America, and then you return. And what was some of the things that struck you?
Mhm. There were very many things that were foreign to me, just from the way of life, the way that school worked, the clothes that people wore, even the language. I needed a lot of adapting. But one thing that um, troubled me, and I only realized this now. I did not understand this when I was just talking to my school peers because I was trying to fit in, right? But reflecting back on that time, I understand that there was a sort of mindset ingrained in people that everything is bad, and the fact that it is bad, it will never change. It is the world is just the way as it is. It is unfair. You need to fit in. Like, what will you do? What can you do? Um, I can't get into university to this specialization because they want to bribe, and that's the way it will stay forever. There is nothing I can do. Don't you know how the world works, Alia? You're so naive. So basically, that was a mindset, and I didn't know that things could be otherwise. And it was a mindset that was really sapping of energy, I guess. It constantly required you to stop dreaming and to acknowledge this, adopt a very pessimistic and very cynical way of viewing things. And I think this is something that set me apart from others during my studies, but I didn't realize it at that point. Um, Now, as I further reflected about it, I understood that this was the relics of a Soviet mentality, because in the Soviet Union, basically, this is how you survive. Because if you went out into the streets with a placard saying, I protest this, the next day you'll be in court, the second day in a gulag, and the third one you'll be dead from overdosing of psychotic chemicals and some psychiatric ward. So, like, this cynical way of life and perception, like, sort of self narratives. So this this narrative that you tell yourself, it's just how the world works. You will not change it, just adapt. Just focus on your own life and your personal life. Just don't stick out. Um, it is how the system persisted. It is this mindset, post-totalitarian mindset, is the reason for why many things went wrong in the first years of Ukraine's independence. And the abandonment of this mindset and the growth of a new generation that is more optimistic about changing things for the better, and that dreams about another country. It is the driver of progress in Ukraine, and it is precisely what Putin wants to destroy, because the success of Ukraine, it hinges on this civil society that dreams, that wants to change things for the better. And an authoritarian state that is a vassal client state to Russia, it is impossible when this free civil society exists. So one of the reasons for Russia's invasion, one of the reasons for Euromaidan happening, for Euromaidan succeeding, and one of the reasons for Russia's invasion is actually the growth of this civic society, the growth of this new mindset that it is possible to change things for the better, and we're going to be making our authorities accountable to the people. We're going to be fostering a new relationship between the people and the government and the authorities. And it is an awakening. It is a national awakening. It is a political awakening. And of course, it's not as fast as many of us would like. It's gradual. But after all, I guess it's going as fast as it can. Yeah. The growth of a middle class in Ukraine, it was very important for the possibility of this reawakening of people that stand firmly on their own legs and are able to invest back into their communities. That's essential for making this happen. So yeah. So you were asking about what was difficult for me to accept. So I guess this was one of the most difficult things for me to grasp, and it is still very, very resistant to change, I think. But you know
Do you
what?
ever?
Hmm? It's
No, go
interesting
ahead. Go
that,
ahead.
yeah, sociologists, there's a term in sociology that reflects when people suddenly start believing in their country, believing in a goal. So there are these times of apathy and disencouragement, and then they can change for periods when people start believing in things, and in those times miracles can happen. And actually, after the invasion of Ukraine, there was this period of uplifting of spirits. It has a special term. I forgot what this term is called in sociology, but it was the time, like the Russians are marching on Kiev. There's this big column of tanks, and 95% of Ukrainians believe that Russia will be defeated. 95% of Ukrainians believe that things are going in the right direction. It's like it's a period when people got together and they started believing in themselves and in their society and in the fact in their own nation. They started believing that yes, having this nation is the best thing that could ever happen to us, and we need it and we want to defend it. So basically, right now, this period of uplifting of spirits, it has changed, unfortunately. It has gotten back to this apathetic situation that was pre-invasion. I saw there was a question there about recruitment. And of course, due to this fall in spirits, it is difficult to recruit soldiers now. But it's just very interesting that this happened when our very government and nation was in mortal danger. There was a real danger that Ukraine would stop existing. And in the face of this, everybody got together and started suddenly believing that this is the most important thing in the world.
Yeah, and I think we
Yeah.
would need to explore more. Thank you, Alya.
Mhm.
And we do have a question from Marta about the recruitment of soldiers, and
Mhm.
that's a very interesting question. I want us to get to it, but I promised the audience to explain the meaning of the term Euromaidan, because you've been
Mhm.
referring to it for several for few times already. Plus, your agency is called Euromaidan Press. So Euromaidan is the term that was coined in late 2013 when then President Yanukovych all of a sudden refused to sign a Ukraine and European Union association agreement. And that drove hundreds, if not thousands, of Ukrainians mostly young people, students, onto the main square called the Independence Square, or Maidan Nezalezhnosti. So Maidan is the Ukrainian word for square. And then during the first few days or weeks, the students stayed on Maidan, out on the square. They're trying to make sure that the government hears their voices because they saw themselves as united with the European Union. And so that period of brief period of Ukrainian history is referred to as Euromaidan. Having to do with Ukraine's inclination to join European Union. And then a few days later, the students were brutally beaten by riot police, and that led to the event known as a Revolution of Dignity, which in turn ended up in the Russians annexing and occupying and annexing Crimea. But this is not the first, as many of you know, this is not the first protest, massive protest in Ukraine, especially in the center of Kiev, on Maidan Nezalezhnosti. The first one was in the late 80s and early 90s, they called a revolution on granite, which basically led to the Ukrainians proclaiming independence and breaking away from the Soviet Union. The second massive protest happened almost like 10 years later, and are known as Orange Revolution. And the orange was the color associated with then candidate President Yushchenko. And then again, 10 years later, Ukrainians had to go back to the Maidan, to the main square, to defend their right to be united with Europe, with the European Union. And Ukraine is, as you all know, basically the heart of Europe and is part of Europe. Anyway, let's go to Marta's question about the recruitment of soldiers, if you don't mind. She's referring to the news of Ukrainian man who left the country to avoid service. Now, this is not a typical question that has to do with Ukrainian maturing, Ukrainian civil society, but I think it's still a very important question, especially coming from not only a virtual service pilot participants, but also a proud member of Ukrainian American community, and also like the Army veteran.
So the question is, how do we understand this?
What's our, I guess the question is, what do we think about men leaving Ukraine to avoid service, to avoid being drafted, to avoid being mobilized?
Well, we need to, first of all, take a look at the stats of how many people would be willing to defend their country with arms if it was invaded. The stats across Europe, they're not very optimistic. I mean, Ukrainians are by far the most willing to defend their country. So, I mean, even Poland, it stands like at about 15%. That's the first thing. We must understand that we're living at a time where not many people are willing to sacrifice their comfort and their everyday life for danger, for an exchange for an idea. It's a time of consumerism, and this is why basically the number of people who are willing to defend their country in the first place is very low. The second thing that we can say about the situation is that there are many myths being spread also about the Ukrainian army. So there are many problems in the army, but there are also many myths that Russia uses in order to decrease the willingness of Ukrainians to defend themselves. So it's part of an ongoing propaganda campaign, which they're using to press on our weaknesses, the weaknesses in the system. Of course, with real problems notwithstanding, there are many real problems that need to be solved in the Ukrainian army. The third thing, of course, is that it's also a function of it's a function that's dependent on the aid that Ukraine is giving. So during the 2023 counteroffensive, there was a situation very often that people were ordered to advance without having artillery to support them, without having the necessary equipment. So if you draft more people into the army, but they don't have the artillery, they don't have the weapons, then it's quite difficult. Like, nobody wants to just die under the prevailing artillery of their opponent. So basically, like the situation, the time when there was the most uplifting of spirits in 2022, when many people were standing still in line to enlist, that was the time when Ukraine's partners, they were not delivering what they could deliver in terms of equipment. So basically, this window of opportunity was missed. And after this, with the unsuccessful 2023 counteroffensive, this generated a lot of pessimism also. So, it's like when there are successes, it's not only in Western media that everybody is having an uplifting of spirits and imagining positive scenarios. It's the same thing in Ukraine. Whenever there are successes, many people want to enlist. They want because they see that a way that this could end positively. This morale, it's very important. So this window of opportunity in 2022, it was missed, fortunately. And I also, I mean, with Zelensky deliberating on announcing tightening mobilization rules, yes, that also played a role. So it's a complex situation, you know, and the and what else more? I feel that I'm probably not the right person to criticize the people who are escaping, because I'm not in the army myself. I mean, and I don't have this sword, Damocles sword hanging over my head because I'm a woman. And I guess that's also a narrative that's being used in Ukraine, that this is unfair for only men to do this, to men um, to be obliged to hold to defend their country, while women they could just live on as usual. So you know, it's complicated, but it all depends. It really depends on the morale, and morale depends on having support of Ukraine's allies and also having a plan. Morale really depends on the willingness of Ukraine's partners to ensure Ukraine's victory. And this is something that we're not seeing right now.
Yeah, and if I may, I'm using my right of the moderator to provide my opinion on the matter, to answer Martha's question, because it's an important question that ultimately any citizen of any country will have to decide on. So I think when we talk about Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian army trying to resist the Russian invasion, I think the mistake and the trap that many Western, and by the way, there's a new slang that I just learned from the Ukrainians when they talk about Western audience. It's called Westerns. And I almost said it. Westerns, meaning like people from the West, as opposed to Westerners. But I think it's one of the things that people do not understand is that Ukrainian army is a Ukrainian civil society, basically. Many of these soldiers have not been trained to be soldiers. The majority of them never thought that the war will be their, their profession. Many of them did not have a choice. A lot of them volunteered to mobilize. Again, having had no prior military experience, having had no prior desire to join the military. So it gets to me, like every time I hear about our Western partners refusing to support the military, I'm like, you're refusing to support the civil society. You're refusing to support Ukrainian civil society. Think of how many countries in the past 10, 12, 20, 30 years have resisted a much larger enemy in every single sense. Think about it. Can you think of anyone? Can you think of any country? I can't. Many men and women, by the way, have chosen to flee Ukraine, even from the places which were not super dangerous, that were not on the front lines, they were not in the eastern Ukraine. And they have to live with that choice. I know many of them find sympathy when they go to America. Many of them come up with stories to get the aid that they want. And that's their choice, and there's something that they have to live with. But I also know that there were thousands of Ukrainian men crossing the border, but not from Ukraine into Poland, but from Poland into Ukraine, and from Romania into Ukraine, and from Moldova into Ukraine and other parts of the country to come to Ukraine and defend the country, abandoning their way of living, abandoning their comfort of safety, just feeling it was the right thing for them to do. And also, I think another trap that many folks in the West fall into is, specifically from the United States, is that the United States, and I may say like a really unpopular thing that's gonna come back, bite me in the back, but among other things, America is a great country which harbors people who flee things, who flee wars, who flee conflicts, as they say. Now we may argue, do we call them cowards, or do we call them fighters, or do we call them like, people who want just to live and they're not made to be in the war? But the question that I'm struggling to understand, and maybe you can help me, is like, if you have the country that is built on immigrants that flee conflicts, what kind of mentality do they bring into the country? What kind of mentality do they pass on to their children and grandchildren? Being victims of certain regimes, never having the guts to stand up to those regimes. Again, this is very controversial. I know that there may be many angry people on the other side. But Ukraine has been at war since 2014, not since 2022. So we know a little bit about the war. Even though, and I have to say that every single Ukrainian, I think, has some form of guilt, whether they're in the trenches, whether they're in a military headquarters in Kiev, feeling guilty they're not in the trenches. Volunteering, Ukrainians who volunteer to support the military. I know many men who do that. Like I consider myself a volunteer who supports the military. But am I brave enough to actually just quit this session right now and go to the conscription office and sign the conscription papers and get mobilized? That's a moral question that every Ukrainian is struggling with. But this is also a question, whenever you ask this question, I think you have to think about yourself and your family. Whether you are prepared to make these choices. And last point that I wanted to make, and I'm not the one who've come up with this genius idea, but rather thought. If Ukraine falls, God forbid Ukraine falls, the Russians are going to mobilize the remaining men and send them to war to other countries in the European Union and the rest of the world. They've been explicitly clear about this intent. And we're talking about the army, now that I'm talking about Ukrainians, we're talking about Ukrainian army who has been seasoned in the warfare, but now being recruited by the Russian, not recruited, but sent as cannon fodder to the Western trenches. But also think about the Ukrainian army, now called the Russian army, that is bearing some grievances about the lack of Western support from the allies that failed to provide that support. And this is the dangerous thought, like many of the wars that Russians have waged over the past several centuries, many of them were successful because at the front lines there were Ukrainian citizens, well, the Ukrainians, the ethnic Ukrainians. So think about it. Think about next time you hear your senator or congressperson saying no to support Ukraine. You never know when the Ukrainian soldiers will cross the border wearing the Russian flag on their uniform and trying to revenge for the West failing Ukraine. And I'll stop here. I probably said too many things that I shouldn't have said, but we do have questions from the audience.
Yeah, I just want to support your assessment of like this military service as a civic duty, as the highest expression of civic activism, because very many of my friends from the civic activist sector, from civil society sector, they felt it was their duty to go to the front because they were the change makers and they understood what is at stake. And very many of them are serving since that time. So they saw that they had no other way, because I mean, if Ukraine falls to Russia, there will be no space to build a democratic country in. There will be no more place for us to live and to build this wonderful country that we've been dreaming of. There will only be an authoritarian repressive state that we see in Belarus, that we see in Russia. So it is the highest duty, civic duty, and most of the people on the front right now, they're not professional soldiers. They never thought they would hold a gun in their life. They just picked it up because they wanted to defend their country. Another thing about this mobilization is, I think, a major factor is that since this feeling of danger has subsided, so Kiev is no longer under threat. The army is holding back the Ukrainian army is holding back the Russians, and there is no longer this feeling of acute threat. No longer feeling that, it's really in a war of survival. So I think this is also behind the fact that many.
But if I may, Alya, if I
Yeah.
may, I think when you're talking about acute threat, I agree with you. But I think that acute threat used to come from the physical presence of a Russian army in your city, on the outskirts of your city. Because every night, every day, we have air raid, we have missiles, we have drones, we have, many places around Ukraine, we have glide bombs, which is like caused the most havoc and devastation, and those take very few seconds to hit the target, but cause massive destruction.
No, everybody is under threat. No
Yeah.
wonder about, no question.
Exactly.
But the feeling of threat of occupation by the Russian army,
Exactly.
it is gone from many cities. Yeah.
So my suspicion would be if the Russians make a really rapid advance, because they're advancing every day. They're advancing as we speak. They claim 2 or 3, 5 kilometers of Ukrainian territory every day. It's slow and people don't pay attention, but that's every day many soldiers, but you can also call them civil society activists, die trying to defend whatever land they try to protect. But I think as soon as the Russians make a really rapid advance onto some of the major cities in the center and the western Ukraine, I think we're likely to see what we had seen in 2022. Some people choose to fly. Some people choose to flee. Some people choose to fight. To either flee or fight mentality, and we're going to see a lot more Ukrainians who have not joined the army yet. They will do so when the enemy is literally at the gate. Anyway, we have a couple of questions that popped in. So we have a question from, I think it was David. So let me see. I thought I was a question from David.
We have one from Ina Monikovska and Yulia
Yeah.
Budenko. Those are the only two I've seen. They're in the chat and the Q&A.
Okay. Okay, so question from Ina. In light of the massive forced migration from Ukraine and the demographic and socio-economic challenges this poses for Ukraine's reconstruction, what would be your advice regarding governmental policies to encourage the return of these people? Providing incentives or stimuli could be problematic due to the perceived societal injustice felt by those who have endured staying in Ukraine, while threats and punishment would conflict with European law and human rights. How can this dilemma be resolved?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that foreign governments can do is to try to solve problems of internally displaced peoples at home. Many people in Ukraine who have lost their homes from the most vulnerable populations, they actually have not been able to emigrate because they would never be able to make it in another country. They're just too old. They don't know other languages. So basically what we're seeing is a brain drain. The most youngest, the most adapted, the most educated population has fled. But really, the problem of IDPs in Ukraine, it has not gone away. Basically, it is a huge challenge, housing for IDPs. So what foreign governments could be doing is creating conditions for IDPs to live in Ukraine, and creating conditions for them to work in Ukraine. We have seen examples of foreign capital being invested in large factories where people could actually work, where Ukrainians could work. And this is ongoing despite the war. There were some encouraging examples for this. So what people in Ukraine need is a place to live and a way to earn money. And are the two major challenges that stand before IDPs and before all Ukrainians really at time of war. It's a challenge just living your daily life, especially if you're a mother with children, if you're a single mother with children, because just earning a living for them when prices have skyrocketed, it's a huge problem for very many Ukrainians. So what you can do is create working conditions, create working places in Ukraine, and help IDPs solve the living problem in Ukraine. You don't need to bring them out. You don't need to facilitate this brain drain. Help them stay in Ukraine and help them work in Ukraine.
Thank you. And if I may, my assessment, I'm not economist by any fact, but I think jobs and economic opportunities will do the miracle. Like if there are jobs and if there's interest in pursuing economic benefits in Ukraine after the war, I think people will move. You don't have to incentivize them to move. Speaking of Ukrainians, I doubt, quite honestly, I doubt that these Ukrainians that have left Ukraine 2.5 years ago will come back, will move back. I mean, they're still coming back, for visits, they still have apartments, they have houses that they rent out, they have businesses. But I think for people to want to move to Ukraine, whether they're Ukrainians who've left Ukraine or whether they're just foreigners, I mean, you have to create favorable economic conditions, simple rules of the game, transparent courts, just court systems, and people will come.
What you said about, I just want to second on the courts and creating fair conditions for everyone. Basically, we're seeing this. I mean, there was Ukraine was a country from which people emigrated before the war. It was because they sought better opportunities outside Ukraine. The story of Ukraine's civil society is about creating a country where people would want to live, from which they would not want to emigrate, a country to which other people would want to come. It's about creating this system of governance. It's about creating this system of relations in society. And it's a very challenging feat that was jump-started by Euromaidan, for which very many people that were dreamers, Ukrainian dreamers, they worked towards. But there were always very many people in Ukraine that just wanted to seek a better life, and they were emigrating before the war, and basically this process was just accelerated. So it's really a heartbreaking situation because we're losing the most capable, the most educated part of our population. And I'm just seeing that many countries, they're benefiting from this. For instance, Germany, they're having an influx of Ukrainian doctors that are taking care of their elderly population. That means a Ukrainian doctor that was educated in Ukrainian school and 10 years in university, it is now lost for Ukraine, basically. It's a complicated situation, but I'm afraid that EU countries, they're using it to their benefit, unfortunately. And it's difficult, but as Roman said, creating economic conditions back in Ukraine will be a great solution.
Yeah, and I agree with Alya about, Western countries benefiting from Ukrainian workforce, educated workforce, the workforce that learns fast, that brought children with them, that learn fast, and that they're gonna, support and enrich their economies. And yet these Western allies still refuse to support Ukrainian with the much desired means to defend ourselves. I want to say shame on them. And I'm talking about politicians who exploit these things. So we have a question from Yulia. I would like to ask Alya's assessment of the current situation with freedom of media in Ukraine, taking into account the recent statements of the Ukrainska Pravda and the fact that the United News Marathon got the public budgeting for the next year, despite the drastic decline of trust from the Ukrainian society and notices from the allies, namely the US and the EU, that the news marathon doesn't affect the development of media landscape positively. Could you please share your visions and the main risks and perspectives for the Ukrainian media in the near future? And I think before you answer, I think we have to clarify what the news marathon is, right? Would you be willing to do so? Because I can, but
yeah, sure. Yeah. So the news marathon is it's a program that runs on many Ukrainian medias where basically government speakers will go on air and share their opinions. And it has been criticized lately because it is providing a very positive picture of events, and it is not giving the space to ask critical questions and to have the discussions that are needed to find solutions that Ukraine drastically needs. So basically, it has basically been accused of promoting a very simplified version of events. And soldiers in particularly, they accuse the marathon as presenting a too positive picture of events, too rosy, too simplified, and not really telling Ukrainians how serious it all is. So it's like, yeah, if you listen to the marathon, there are only victories there. It only tells about victories, and the Ukrainian army is about to take Crimea tomorrow. So it's been accused of this. About the situation with media freedom, it's complicated because Ukraine is at war, and while the media community is far from accusing Zelensky of censorship, there have been some troubling tendencies lately, but we need to always keep our perspective, because we have examples of Belarus, we have examples of Russia where there is absolutely no media freedom. And we have Ukraine, which is a country at war, but it's doing a great job actually with media freedom. So if we look at the accusations that the media movement, which we are part of, the statements that it has been releasing lately. So this latest statement about Ukrainska Pravda is one of the leading Ukrainian online newspapers. It was the accusations levied against the president's office is that a man has appeared that is basically facilitating the silencing of government officials. The man is telling government officials not to speak to Ukrainska Pravda, not to attend their events, and also the president's office is pressuring some advertisers, not some businesses, not to place ads with Ukrainska Pravda, therefore depriving it of funds. So Ukrainska Pravda is seeing this as a way of pressure, right? It's not a direct accusation of censorship. It's pressure. Yes, it's bad, but look, this is the sort of thing that gets all the media community agitated. This fact that there is a man that tells government officials not to speak with the newspaper. If we compare this situation in a country at war with a place like Russia or Belarus, it's bad, it's troubling, but we must see the perspective here. We have a vibrant media community that immediately stands up and says, hey, this is unacceptable in a democratic society, that issues these appeals, that says, no, we will not let this pass. So basically, this minor trouble thing, it gets a very strong civic society reaction. And in general, while it is a troubled thing, Ukraine still has a very vibrant and free media landscape. And so this media marathon, of course, it's probably not the best solution, and many media professionals don't like it. Yeah, so it got its budget. Yes, it's not the best use of budget money.
Yeah,
it's not a perfect solution, but such is democracy. They don't like it, but and maybe in another time we would be able to stop this marathon, but right now, no.
Yeah. There's one thing that
Yeah.
I don't like about the term marathon as it is applied to all these conglomeration of media that are being directed by the president's office, what to say, what not to say. The word marathon itself, how long is your marathon going to last? It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's an inconvenient explanation. This marathon should have ended 6 months after the full-scale invasion, as I expected. But the good news is that very few people, well, I really know the stats, so I can't really say very few people, but fewer people are watching television these days.
Yeah, it's getting less influential. Yeah.
Exactly. And secondly, I don't think Ukraine is gonna, unless subjugated and recolonized by Russia, Ukrainians are not gonna tolerate a dictator president. This is something that is not in our genes. So you should rest. If you see a dictator in Ukraine, that means something went wrong. Something So it should have been prevented, but it wasn't.
That means,
Um,
yeah, that means a genocide has happened, like the
exactly,
Holodomor in the
exactly,
1930s. That was
exactly.
an event that killed 4 million people. That was the sort of event that brings a dictator president to Ukraine.
Right. Think of any other countries of the former, and I hate to use the same terms, former Soviet Union, like Ukraine did not exist before Soviet Union. But anyway, could we predict who is going to be the president of Ukraine, the next president of Ukraine? And I'm only saying this because we're now talking about the U.S. presidential elections, regardless of whether you live in Papua New Guinea or like in Ukraine. Everybody's preoccupied with the U.S. presidential elections, but in Ukraine, you could never predict who's going to be the president. And Ukrainian civil society would always stand up to injustice and the attempts to consolidate power in their hands. So regardless of how we feel about the marathon and all of that, the fact that we're talking about it means that Ukrainians are still independent and they're still pretty upset whenever we hear about dictators. So we have a question from Andy. When I served in the Peace Corps in 2017 and 2018, my best English students were motivated by a desire to leave Ukraine, a fallacious belief I tried very hard to overcome through my diasporan patriotism. The same with class I taught through the VSPP program last semester. So VSPP stands for Virtual Service Pilot Program that Peace Corps Ukraine administers. How does Ukraine counteract, sorry, I can't speak English anymore, this consciousness that seems to predate current hostilities? Wow, so many cool questions today. What can we in the West, us Westers, can change the narrative? Once Ukraine
Okay,
wins the
so
war, yeah, you've read. You've
so
researched it.
the author of this question is from the diaspora and came to Ukraine to help Ukraine, right? Am I understanding this correctly? Yeah. So
He
there's
lived in Ukraine for some time, but he's now in the U.S. But he supports Ukraine every day, every week.
but diaspora, right? Ukrainian
Yes,
diaspora.
correct.
Okay. So this is a very common thing with the Ukrainian diaspora that have grown up with an idealized vision of Ukraine. I have seen this while I was living in the United States. They have this ideal version of Ukraine in their heads where it's all about cherry blossom gardens and women in vyshyvankas singing songs. And it ignores the turbulent history of Ukraine in the 20th century. It ignores the post-authoritarian legacy. Ukraine is a deeply wounded society. These decades of totalitarianism, they have made a very deep impact. And the Soviet mentality that nothing can ever change, therefore we must live our best lives in a country where that pays us more. It is still very prevalent, and it is born from the idea that you cannot change anything. Everything in this country will remain as it is, and it is impossible to change. And this is why people do not try to do anything. They adopt this very passive stance. They adopt a passive stance, and they blame others for their troubles, often ignoring what they could actually be doing to improve things. This is why the birth of the civil society, the emergence of a civil society, the best of Ukrainian people that actually do dream, that do know that things are possible to change, that understand that the work of democracy, hard work of democracy, it is hard, it is grueling, but it is possible. And it is this sector of society that sets us apart from Belarus and from Russia, because there, these people, they could not change things. There were also activists, but there were not enough of them, and they could not change the trajectory of their countries. So, like what makes Ukraine different is actually the presence of people who think otherwise, who are determined to change things here. But of course, there will always be many people who just want to live their best life in a place that pays them more, unfortunately. And I think a major thing that sets apart these people is the ability to dream, is the ability to have to be to and I'm struggling to find the right word, but it's also a feeling that you need to give back to your community also. You know, like the people of the Soviet Union, they were very traumatized by this society where they were told that they have to be like a screw in the machine. That is your place. You need to be a screw in this machine. And you know, it's this trauma of being forced to collectivism, to collective action. It's also was like a vaccine against real activism and real community building. And it's still very prevalent. It is this when I described this feeling among my school peers that said it's all bad, it will never change. This hopelessness, yes, it's a feeling of hopelessness that drives these people to emigrate. But what I personally am hoping for is that there are more dreamers emerge in Ukraine, and more people who are willing to do the heavy lifting, more people that are determined to build a good society here, no matter what it takes. It is because of these people that Ukraine is not Russia and that Ukraine is not Belarus.
Yeah, thank you. And I have to respond. I have to relay Andy's comment that he's not a typical diasporan. First generation steeped in customs and history. We're not as vanilla and disinformed. So I think we've reached the end of our session today, and I feel like we barely touched the subject for some reason.
We need another
Um,
hour
I know. So
at
many
least.
cool questions and really interesting questions. So, but you know, I want to be respectful of people's time and respectful of Alya's time. What is one question that I never asked you today?
One question that
Specifically
you
when we
never
talk
asked me.
about, yeah, specifically when we talk about civil society, what is one message that you want our audience to leave this webinar with?
I'll do a little bit of self-promotion. So Euromaidan Press, it's actually a media outlet that was born out of the civil society movement, because we felt a duty that we had to inform the world about what was happening in Ukraine, against the backdrop of even the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs not having a regularly updated English version. Our volunteers are literally translating text for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs so they could put it on their website. So it was from this feeling of community that we had to serve our country in some way, because what our country is very important. It's very important that this nation happens, that this nation deserves a chance to live. And this is what got so many people, volunteers from around the world, united to build the media outlet where I'm working at presently. And basically, we are continuing our mission to inform the world, to build bridges between the world and Ukraine. And I'm very proud to be part of this initiative that has this mission of community, of serving the community. And I just want to tell all of you that it is possible for all of you to change this world. It is possible. Change is possible. You just have to work hard to make it happen. So just a note of encouragement that everything is in your hands and everything is possible to change.
And as a happy subscriber to the European Press on social media, I find your information, the news that you present to the world in English, very helpful to me. If
Thank you. So please subscribe. Please read us. Yeah, we'll be happy to have you among our audience.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Alya. I will let Sarah do the closing ceremony, if you're okay with that.
Yes, I just choked up there a little bit. Hearing Alya's words at the end that there is hope, and that you can change things. I mean, I think this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you, Alya, for the work you're doing with Euromaidan Press, which, just to echo Roman, is an amazing, amazing resource. And to hear the history of that and how you got involved in that is very inspiring. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. We know how busy you are, and how many other pressing things you have. So it means a tremendous amount. And thank you to our attendees. Many of these are names I've recognized over the past year. They join every week, and we have new names as well. So thank you to all of you for being here, for paying attention, for asking these hard questions. And I know that never everyone's not in agreement on what was said today. And I think it's powerful to have that conversation that's hard about the military and service and who returns and who doesn't and diaspora questions. I mean, if we can have those conversations, I think we can do anything. So, but thank you to Alya. Дякую, дуже дякую.
I see a couple of,
Thank you.
sorry,
Thank you
I
for inviting
interject.
me.
I see a couple of comments in the chat from Tamara
Yes,
and
yeah.
Courtney, and I really like the one that, because I know Courtney is studying nationalism in Vienna. She just moved there. I think it's about time we talk about the N word, not the word that you thought about, but the other N word, which is nationalism, which has sort of like become like a boogeyman in America, but in somehow used differently, and sometimes manipulated when talking about Ukraine. So just a food for thought.
So possibly the next topics for your seminars. Yeah.
Alya, thank you, and hopefully one day
Thank
we'll
you.
see you back.
Okay,
Thank
for that, I'll be
Thank-
delighted.
Thank you
Yes,
so
thank you. Bye bye. Have a good
Thank you
day.
so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.